one of the issues you deal with in conflict again and again is a concept of idolatry. Conflict starts in the heart. James 4:1-2 says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires or your passions that war within you? And I've seen this dynamic again and again and again. We have an initial desire, and it might be something like, I want to see us be more effective in sharing the gospel in our community, having a better witness to our church, growing the number of people worshiping with. That's a great desire. That's a great desire. But our desires often turn into demands. And it's not just something I desire, but I have to have this. And typically I have to have this my way on my schedule. And so these desires that may be good to begin with begin to consume us. One of the most interesting cases I was involved in was where a pastor or an elder began a campaign against the pastor to basically drive him out of the church using gossip, slander, backbiting, politics, and it blew up the church. And when I met with that elder, I was saying, why did you do this? He said, well, he wasn't sharing the gospel enough in our community. And I thought, now that's a good desire, but you realize that you committed all sorts of sin to accomplish that desire, to get somebody in that was more evangelistic. And it took a while for this guy to grasp the fact that he had a good desire, but because he demanded it, he then began to judge the pastor as being inadequate and wrong and failing in his role. And he found a way to punish, and he did. He started spreading rumors, talking behind his back and everything else, and it blew up the church. Now, I see this in my own life. I saw this when our children were young. They're now 28 and 30, but when they were young, there were certain things I wanted to see them do. They'd be respectful and diligent and treat each other well and love their mother, all sorts of good desires. And yet days where they were not doing that, I would become frustrated with my kids. I would lecture them. I would discipline them inappropriately. Same dynamic. Good desire became a consuming demand. I judged and I punished. And for those of you who are married, if you really looked at your marriage, you probably see that same dynamic even in your relationship with your spouse at times. So that's a very common thing we have to deal with, is recognizing. So the way I help people to recognize that, we see the conflict. That's usually where I get involved. It's where they have punished and attacked and undermined and criticized each other. And then we try to work our way backwards up that progression. Okay, what was the initial good desire and where did it go wrong? Where do you need to confess to God and to this other brother or sister where you began to demand your way and began to judge them and then began to punish them? And so the real answer to that kind of idolatry is confession. Father, forgive me. I have elevated this desire to the point where I could not be satisfied without it. I allowed it to motivate me to do sinful things contrary to your word, which has dishonored you, hurt your body, hurt this other person. Father, please forgive me. Help me, Lord, that there's only one God in my life, and that is you, that you're the one I trust. You're the one where I find safety. You're the one where I find purpose. And even if nothing else goes the way I want, that is all I need. You are my God. You're my source of contentment. So we have to replace those idols with a stronger focus on God himself as the one who meets all of our needs in his way. Now, one of the ways that idolatry plays itself out is a concept called amygdala hijacking. And that's not a term you find in the Bible, but you see it illustrated over and over again in the Bible. Amygdala hijacking is a neuropsychology process where the way the brain works is that the amygdala is a part of our limbic system, the emotional part of the brain. And it's basically where we store our memories of experiences and the associated emotions. So both, the day we got married, or the day we had a first child, or a promotion, or a great success of some kind, all sorts of positive things, memories that evoke positive emotions, but then also the painful emotions. The day that a father abandoned the family, walked away and left us. The day that we lost a child to some disease, the day that our church blew up, the day of a bad performance review that just left you humiliated. And those experiences with those emotions attached to them are things that can trigger reactions today that are inappropriate and unhelpful. So just for example, if you had a very bad job performance review with a previous employer and you're about to go into a new job performance review, the memories and the fears from that previous experience can trigger some strong emotions today that are inappropriate and not helpful. And the typical dynamic of a amygdala hijacking is something triggers an emotion. Someone says something, someone does something. You think of concepts like road rage, people getting angry on the highway, someone cuts us off in traffic. There's strong emotions that trigger an impulsive reaction. Often it's verbal. We say something without thinking. And then often right away we regret it. And I've experienced this again and again, where I've been in a conversation with my wife where we're unhappy with each other and I get provoked to anger and I say something. And there's been times, even before the whole sentence is out of my mouth, I'm realizing, oh, this was not a good thing to say, but it's too late. The words have already gone out. They've impacted my wife's heart and sometimes triggered amygdala hijacking in her. Now, if you want to have an example of how those emotions and fears and desires, excessive desires, can trigger impulsive actions we quickly regret, you only have to look at the story of Peter when he followed Jesus up into Jerusalem when he was arrested, and people were saying, "You were with him, weren't you?" No, I wasn't. Hey, you were with him. I saw. No, I don't even know this man. So right there, not long before that, Peter had said, "I will die with you, Jesus. I will die with you. I will not abandon you." And yet when he has that opportunity, the fear of harm that he would experience was so strong, that strong emotion triggered an impulsive reaction. And as the scriptures say, he went outside, he leaned up against the wall, and he wept. He regretted it within moments. And that you can see that kind of reaction throughout the Bible, and we certainly see it in our own lives. I'm going to come back to this question in just a moment. Someone put one up, so thank you for that. So amygdala hijacking, one of the ways to counter amygdala hijacking, something I would encourage you to teach to your whole church, is a concept we call the read acrostic. And I love acrostics, and I know they don't come across well in other languages, but it's something we use a lot for people in our country. And the acrostic is basically a summary of a 4-step process to learn how to get better control over your emotions and the things that you say. And basically the read acrostic is, in any situations, to realize, first of all, that our emotions are like wind in the sails. Our emotions move us. The word actually is derived from a word that means to move, a Latin word which means to move. So emotions move us. And so when you're in a situation where emotions are getting volatile, you want to, first of all, recognize and name them, and identify what is the emotion. I'm feeling fear, jealousy, anger, excitement, anticipation, whatever the emotion is, and name it. And just the process of naming an emotion, what it does neurologically is it forces, you're not just working in your emotional part of your brain, the rational part of the brain, the neocortex, where you do your reasoning, impulse control, scripture, memorize scripture, principles learned in sermons, life experiences. Those things come together with our emotions, and now our brain is working the way God designed. We have emotions moving us, but they are under the control of our will and our reasoning and our logic and God's sanctifying work in our lives. So just recognizing and naming an emotion is a key first step. Then we evaluate, why do I feel this way? And go back to that James passage. What causes fights and quarrels? There's usually something I want so much I'm willing to hurt people. Third thing is anticipate, what happens if I give in to this emotion? What happens if I give in to this emotion? What's going to happen if I say this thing to the other person, or do this, or I yell at my boss and say he's a jerk? Well, I may get fired tomorrow. And then direct. How do I take these emotions and channel them into a constructive direction? Very simple concept: recognizing and naming, evaluating why we feel this way, anticipating the consequences, And of course, the whole book of Proverbs is basically choices have consequences. Make this choice, this is the consequence. Make this choice, this is the consequence. And part of Christian maturity is learning to think through the consequences, the potential consequences of our choices, and then using that knowledge to move them in a constructive direction. I'm going to come back to the questions. There's been some good questions popping up here. I want to get to those in just a moment. Just share one more concept with you. Many of the conflicts that I've been involved in, personally, as a church elder and as a mediator, came about because people assumed the worst about someone else. They heard something or saw something. They gave it the worst possible interpretation, the most negative interpretation, and then they responded to that negative interpretation. And then later found out they were completely wrong. I did this just a couple days ago. My wife, Corlette, came out and asked me a question. I assumed I knew her motive, and I reacted to the assumed motive and said something hurtful to her. And I can still remember this hurt look on her face. And she just said, okay, fine, don't forget about it. And she walked away. And I realized, I just blew it. And I prayed for a moment, went into the bedroom and apologized. I said, I think I realize what your motive was now. And I misjudged it. She was trying to help me. She was trying to point out something that was going to happen in the day that she thought might be an issue. And she was actually offering to change our schedule so I wouldn't have a problem later in the day. So I assumed a negative emotion when she was actually trying to help me. And I felt so bad about that. And by God's grace, I was able to apologize to her, ask her forgiveness, and she forgave me. We got back on track. But that kind of process happens again and again in our relationships. We see something that's not clear and we make the worst possible interpretation. So charitable judgments is a term that has been used for a long time in the church. It's the idea that when we see something or hear something, get into a situation that can be interpreted in one of two ways, either positively or negatively, out of love for God and the other person, we use the best possible interpretation until we have facts to prove otherwise. When in doubt, take the most positive interpretation rather than the most negative one. The communicate so clearly you cannot be understood is the idea that when you're a leader, especially, a lot of the confusion that comes up in the church is we communicate something that may be legitimate, but we communicate it without sufficient clarity, and we leave room for people to misunderstand and make mistakes. So a principle I learned as an engineer, actually, my first career, was for a leader, it's not good enough to communicate so clearly that you can be understood. You should communicate so clearly that you cannot be misunderstood. And that has changed, that has saved me in so many places as a professional, as an engineer and a lawyer, as an elder, as a mediator, is to look at a communication and realize, okay, this says what I want it to, but is there room here for confusion or misunderstanding? And if I leave room for confusion or misunderstanding, I'm actually, in a way, leaving people open to temptation. So as you're communicating to people, just make sure that you're constantly evaluating your own words and say, have I communicated so clearly that I cannot be misunderstood? Now, nobody does that perfectly 100% of the time, but I've just found the more often I give real careful thought to my words, I communicate what I mean. And sometimes I have to say, now, please understand, I'm not saying this. And I'll actually explicitly say, I'm not saying we should do this or this or this. What I am saying is this. And that can save so many situations from grief or from confusion. So those are some principles. I'll come back to the charitable judgments again in a minute. But as a church leader, as a ministry leader, always try to communicate so clearly that you are not likely to be misunderstood. Many conflicts I've seen that actually split churches started because of a communication that was vague or unclear.